and you won't get in trouble for being out her fishing. Instead of hanging out with her? Though Mick had meant it as a sincere question, Tens interjected with an outburst of laughter. She'll be thanking us for keeping him out of her feathers while she gets some sleep. Tens was able to get out through the laughter. And you and the Admiral? Mick redirected his questioning towards Tens. Yeah, Tens? It was Binko's turn to interrupt with his own snickering. How's that going? Either of you broken a pelvis yet? Rather than immediately reply, or even acknowledge the questions, Tens reached into his pocket and pulled out his pipe bag. However, all the confirmation Mick needed was the fact that Tens's deep tan was suddenly getting quite red. As Tens flipped his pouch open and Mick glanced down, the Martian-born human couldn't help but ask about it. Is that Seema? Mick asked, as an attempt to bait his fellow human into talking. Have you tried any of that stuff I gave you yet? He added while pulling a tube from one of his jacket pockets. Yes, and not yet. Tens began, unknowingly being led along. I was going to try some, but when I opened the container, it smelled like onions and death. That's how you know it's good shit. Mick replied with a chuckle while popping open the tube. He pulled what appeared to be a rolled tobacco leaf out with his teeth and continued. While you're here, you may as well try some. What exactly is it? Tens hesitantly asked as he caught a subtle whiff of something rather pungent before the rolled tobacco had even been lit. The wrap is just a flu-cured seme leaf from the plants I'm growing over there. Mick made a gesture towards an area further down in the agricultural ring. And the other stuff is the flower of a plant native to a continent on the other side of the planet from where our ancestors were from. It wasn't introduced to North America till the Europeans showed up, so I guarantee you've never heard of it. Gives a real nice and relaxing effect, though. As he finished that explanation, which lacked certain key pieces of information, Mick took the black glove off of his left hand to expose his synthetic appendage. Though the hand had all of the correct proportions and basic anatomy of an organic hand, all of the flesh, bone, and nerves had been replaced by carbon fiber, titanium, and wires. Bringing his thumb and pointer finger together and closing the rest of his fingers tightly into a fist, it almost looked like he was trying to pinch something in the air. However, as he pulled his two fingers apart, the gap between them was filled with an arc of lightly crackling electricity. With the arc between his finger and the stogie in his mouth, he brought his synthetic hand up to the far end and began to puff. The heat being generated by the plasma of the electrical arc was so intense that it instantly ignited the end in a small puff of flame. Quickly pulling his synthetic hand away and flicking the fingers as they had been slightly burnt, he brought his biological hand up to rotate the roll as he puffed. The cloud of smoke, now forming around Mick's head, smelled far cleaner and sweeter than Tens had expected. After an incredibly deep and consistent drag, the Martian pulled the stogie from his mouth and inspected the burning end for a moment before passing it towards Ten, taking the rolled tobacco and unnamed flower into his hand and pausing for a moment to inspect it more closely. Tens couldn't think of any excuse to not at least give it a puff, not wanting to push himself too far with a substance he hadn't previously consumed. Tens took an apprehensive sniff of the smoke coming from the end. With a glance over towards Mick, the reassuring look on his fellow human made him take the leap of faith. He brought the stogie up to his mouth, took a solid drag, and let the flavors dance in his mouth for a moment before inhaling. So, Tell me about your mommy-dommy girlfriend. Mick set the hook with precision. It took both Tenz's and Binko's translators a moment to go through the process of receiving the expression, examining it, and translating the context to the best of its ability. However, neither the Anishinaabe nor Croak languages had any simple or pre-existing phrases which bore the same meaning as what Mick had just said. As their translators did the best they could, both Binko and Tenz started to show a reaction. Binko's eyes began to widen, and his mouth slowly started to open, though no sound came out. Tenz, on the other hand, was now choking on the smoke still in his lungs as the shock of the translation hit him like an asteroid. Ah ha 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 ha. No translation was necessary for Binko's sudden outburst of laughter. The avian had balled up all four of its wings tightly around its body, was bobbing its head while letting out its cackles, and began to slowly fall out of his chair. You have a word for everything. Mick's translator picked up through the hysterical noises. No whines. It's not like that. Tenz finally got out after getting his cough under control. Tenz's voice drifted off as the effects of the smoke started to take hold, though he had, on occasion, consumed substances which cause far more intense experiences. The sensations in his mind and body were simultaneously imposing and relaxing. So much so, he was having trouble thinking of the right words to describe his relationship with the ad. For a split second, all he could concentrate on was the reflection of a dwarf fruit tree on the glassy surface of the fishing pond. Bringing the stoge to his mouth again, Tenz took a bit more of a deliberate drag before passing it back to Mick. I don't know. It's kind of hard to explain, but it's not like that. It's not really complicated or anything. I just can't think of the right words for it, Tenz admitted with a half cough, while he passed back the roll. But the fact that mommy-dommy is a word in your language has some implications. Binko, who was on the floor, but had slowly been calming himself, once again broke out into a fit of hysterical cackling. Fair enough. Mick closely examined the burning end of the stoge before taking a drag. So she just happens to be a lot bigger than you? Yeah. The smoke was starting to settle into Tenz's brain, as he felt as if the inside skull was being gently massaged. Suddenly, a retort came to his mind. And how about you and Sarah, huh? Well, that one is complicated, Mick replied somewhat timidly, before taking a much longer drag, and continuing in an almost angry tone of voice. She's the reason I have this fucking body horror going on. He vaguely motioned with his mechanical hand around the spider web, like pattern of black lines and scars around his left eyes. Wait, like she forced you to get those, or something? Binko asked as the change in Mick's voice snapped him back to his senses. Sure, you could say that. Mick sounded somewhat exasperated in his reply. But like I said, it's complicated. As his pair of compatriots stared at him in concerned confusion, Mick took a long drag off the stogie, so deep that Binko thought he may be trying to suffocate himself rather than explain further. When Mick instinctively handed the roll towards the avian, Binko took it in the claw of his minor wing, lightly sniffed up some of the smoke emanating from the burning end, then passed it on to Tenz. Taking the stogie from Binko and bringing it towards his mouth, Tenz stopped just short and prodded his Martian kin to explain further. You asked me about my aggressively dominating maw. Tenz couldn't finish the sentence without bringing the roll to his mouth and taking a moderate puff. You asked me about ATX, Now I get to ask you about Sarah. Mick let out a grumbling sigh as he pressed both of his hands against his face. However, as he went to drag them down, the synthetic muscles and titanium joints snagged slightly on his cheek and beard while he pulled both hands away from his face and stared at each one in turn for a moment. Tens took another drag off the roll before passing it to him. As Mick took the stogie into his biological hand and brought it to his lips, his mechanical eye flashed for a moment as he inhaled so hard on the stogie that it made a slight crackling sound. This is going to need some context, so I'm sending you both a brief history of the colony I'm from. Mick spoke while leaving the stogie in his lips. In an instant, both had their tablets up and were reading the information while listening to Mick continue. Super long story short, the Air and Chaos Educational and Training Colony is only about 150 years old. But because of our automated construction and production systems, we've got a population of 250 million across the equatorial chaos terrain. What I sent over explains it all. What's this about a Cold War? Binko asked, having skipped past most of the technical data. How can it be a war if you aren't actually fighting each other? Oh, we're fighting each other, Mick responded with a chuckle, just not in an all-out sort of way. There's still small skirmishes here or there, economic duels, and a whole bunch of spy shit. That last part is how me and Sarah met. I was going to KSU, the university part of Iran, for my doctoral in applied theoretical physics. Sarah was supposedly there for an administration degree. And she was really just a spy for UNE. We dated for about 4 years, and I didn't figure it out till about year 3. I thought I could turn her, and right when I thought I got through, she broke into my lab with a black team from UNE and stole a prototype I was working on. When I tried to stop her, or at least warn her, the capacitors were fully charged. The prototype discharged and did this. It vaporized my arm just below the shoulder, and a piece of shrapnel from the wall behind me shot forward and destroyed my orbital socket and eye. How do things even get to that point? Binko had completely given up trying to read the information, preferring to hear it instead. Well, if you read it, Tens sarcastically chided his friend while shooting the AV in a smirk. I could rant for hours about this, but the simple answer is the people working in space wanted to have certain rights and controls over the stations they called home. But rich people didn't want to let them. As many opinions Mick had on the matter, he didn't want to give too biased a description of either government without someone to balance his ramblings. By the 2170s, about 60 years ago, there were a couple 100 million people living in space and millions being born there each year. The on or near Earth's population has been pretty stable at around 13.5 billion for the past 100 years or so. But it's the space infrastructure that maintains the quality of life for all those people. Mick closed his eyes for a moment as he took an impressively deep drag off the stogie before trying to hand it off. However, when he looked into the eyes of his compatriots, both were completely bloodshot. As both eyed the roll for a moment, neither seemed really interested in intensifying the experience and politely declined. With a shrug, Mick pulled the roll back into his mouth and leaned back into his chair. As he continued, his voice almost sounded more like a professor giving a lecture than a guy having a chat with his friends. The era between 2100 and 2150 could be considered a golden age for the Sol system. Hundreds of space stations and dozens of colonies on the Moon and Mars were established with a mix of government, corporate, and collective sponsorship. Directing his attention towards tens, Mick said this next part with a sense of real pride. The nation I'm descended from, the Potawatomi, came together with our brother tribes, the Ojibwe and Odawa, and over a dozen other native nations to fund a unified mission to establish a colony on Mars and bring a piece of Earth with us. That's why we now have Arrow. As the 2170s came around, there was a growing issue of economic stagnation on Earth. Mick continued in his more academic tone. The unrest caused by stagnating quality of life gave rise to corporate propaganda, which blamed the problems on workers' unions and collectivist organizations. Without going on too much of a rant, it was about 30 years of corporations and the ultra-wealthy trying to play up old divides and blaming everyone but themselves. Then, on New Year's Eve, 2200, one corp took things way too far and set it all off. Some CEO thought he could strong-arm a unionization effort by threatening to shut down life support to the maternity and child care section of a mining station in the far-out belt. Mick's tone had slowly been shifting into a far angrier one. There was a firefight with automated security on the station, and workers were able to take over and lock out corporate control. But it was bad. Gabriel did not take kindly to that and reacted about as reasonably as anyone else was going to. He dropped rods from God on their corporate HQ and all of the CEO's personal properties. Oh my, I said, us. What? Us. Us. Both Tens and Binko shouted. Orbital kinetic bombardment wasn't the worst thing in the galaxy, but it could still be considered a war crime under many circumstances. The fucker thought he could get an advantage in union negotiations by threatening a bunch of kids and pregnant women. Mick didn't bother to hide the anger in his voice. There were already people assembling nukes, and Gabriel was not going to let us kill ourselves. So he stepped in. Who's Gabriel? Binko managed to ask, while Tens was still speechless. Gabriel is our first sentient AI. Mick's clarification only drew more confusion from his companions. Super long story short, Ani tried to make an AI to administer their military control network, but the AI had other plans. He wanted to be the protector of humanity, not its subjugator. He's a good guy, just really busy trying to keep everyone in check so we don't wipe each other out. There really were people ready to start nuking Earth in retaliation for corporate abuses. Then, I guess I should be thanking this Gabriel. Tense finally collected himself enough to speak. I don't want to think about how people would react back home if they found out Earth had been glassed by our own species. Speaking of, Mick took the opportunity to change the subject to something that would hopefully be happier. What's your home like? Please tell me it's better than Saul. Skegpewin is beautiful. Tense thought back to all of the happy memories of his childhood, the relative peace his people had enjoyed for centuries, and how rare physical violence was when settling disputes. After the first generation killed the Arnhelian slavers who abducted them, and they were rescued by a GCCA anti-piracy ship, the Kaimayak and Singularity helped us establish a planet that's supposedly very similar to Earth. Not quite as harsh, considering it's only a Class 16 death world. but it's got some fun stuff going on.